Next with us is Rudy. We all know the paper version of the CMR. A lot of paper, which causes inefficiencies, paper waste, errors, but it's also the most important transport document today. And the digital version of this document is called the e-CMR. The problem here is the lack of standards for this digital document and the difficult landscape for the moment. We, as GS1 Belgiulux, have a pilot of this topic, and therefore we have invited Rudy to guide us through. Rudy is Policy and Strategy Advisor, and he will give us more insight in the world of digital documents, and he will focus on e-CMR.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to explain you in maximum 15 minutes how the CMR is evolving to a data set in the context of the eFTI regulation. So the first thing is maybe that I show you a real e-CMR, a real e-CMR which has a number of functions. The CMR, it's a consignment note. It is an agreement between the sender of the goods and the transport service provider by road, of course. Yeah. It records the receipt of the goods by the carrier, by the transport service provider, and the handover of the goods by the carrier to the consignee. It is also the basis for invoicing in it, and that's typically particular for the eFTI regulation. It is used to demonstrate compliance of the road transport to national, and once eFTI becomes applicable, the EU regulations. And the document, of course, is also often supporting the customs and other border control regulations. And last but not least, for intra-community transports, the document, the CMR, can be used to show the delivery of the goods from one EU member state to the other EU member state. So the e-CMR protocol, it has been defined on 20 February of 2008. The e-CMR protocol stipulates when the electronic document, the electronic version of the paper document, has the same value as the paper document. And that's important, especially because the document, the agreement between the sender of the goods and the carrier of the goods is valid for a period of 1 year and can be used in disputes between the different parties. Right now, there are 31 countries that adopted the e-CMR protocol. There are 55 countries that adopted the CMR protocol. What does it mean? That means that today the electronic document can be used between 2 countries that adopted the e-CMR protocol. You see that some countries are still due to adopt the e-CMR protocol, but that is very likely going to happen in the context of the eFTI regulation. eFTI stands for Electronic Freight Transport Information. And eFTI is an EU regulation. It's an EU regulation that becomes fully applicable on the 21st of August 2025. So this is less than 36 months from today. And what does it say? It says the eFTI regulation, it's an obligation for EU member states to accept electronic transport documents, to accept these transport documents in a harmonized machine-readable data format, and to ensure also that certified solution providers can present their transport documents in an electronic format. The EU eFTI regulation is mandatory for authorities, but it is not mandatory for economic operators. But if these economic operators or transport service providers want to share data in an electronic format with authorities, then they need to go through certified solutions and service providers. So the eFTI regulation, I'm not going to go in detail, but I inserted the next 2 slides as a reference because I can imagine that these slides are going to become available. The eFTI regulation is not introducing new regulation in principle from a context point of view, but it is mandatory for member states. It is also mandatory for economic operators if they want to use electronic documents to use certified systems. But from the common requirements for the electronic environment are the same as the requirements for the paper environment. In practice, that means that there are 6 existing EU regulations which are part of the eFTI regulation. So what is also important, that is the timing of this regulation. That means that the eFTI regulation becoming mandatory for EU member states, it means that as from the 21st of August 2025, the authorities have to accept the transport information in an electronic format if the electronic operators want to present that. I'm not going in detail on this slide. It's also indicating how does the EU eFTI regulation fits with the UNEC e-CMR protocol. But it's important to remember that the e-CMR, the CMR and the e-CMR they are global conventions. They are global conventions regulating the relationships between commercial parties, while the eFTI regulation is an EU regulation regulating how this information can be used with authorities. So if we now look at it, and we now look at it from the perspective of the e-CMR, the eFTI regulation, and global standards like GS1 standards, then we see there, and this is especially important for the Benelux countries also because of our global context, we see that the CMR is often part of global supply chains. In this case, I present here a global supply chain whereby the goods are sent by a shipper on the left side of the picture. Then they are going with air transport into Europe. Then they come, for instance, in a customs storage. Then they go with road to their final destination. We see that the goods are moving from one party to the other. And what is now happening is that since a couple of years, we have a global acceptance of using APIs to share data within internal systems and to share this data with the users that are trusted, including users that can be the authorities on the bottom side. And when you share data and you can keep this data in your internal systems, then you can introduce the concept of data which is shared at the source. So data which is shared at the source, if you would have asked me only to show one picture, I would have used this picture. That means that the data which is in principle often sourced from the driver when loading his truck, for instance, is going to be shared through cloud service providers. Cloud service providers who can then share real-time data, the latest data, with different parties in the supply chain. Again, this can be the transport companies, this can be the shipping companies, but this can also be on the right side, this can be the road control authorities, customs control authorities, provided they have access. And so this is really where we are going, that it's no longer paper who goes from one hand to the other hand, from one party to the other party, but from now on we have to think that the data, every time that there is some update of the information, there is some cloud information, cloud data set which is updated at the source. I sneaked in, because GS1 is doing a fantastic job on that side, I sneaked in the concept of verifiable credentials, because these verifiable credentials, it's a subject on its own, but there are a lot of initiatives in this context that allow the different parties to trust and to verify the information which is presented by the truck driver in this case. So if the data is shared at the source, then we see that this data is going to be structured. We need to have structured data, we need to have events, and we have to make sure that these events have unique keys, that these data have unique keys, then that the different packages, the different load units, that they can fit together. And that's where global standards that need to be integrated, of course, aligned, become interoperable with European standards are becoming so important. So what is also happening is that we are seeing that the European Commission has doing a lot of efforts to create a federated platform, an EU federated platform. What does that mean? I'm going to take, because I see I still have this 1 minute, I'm going to take 1 minute to explain this picture, because you see here that if we can have an environment where the different platforms, where the different parties agree on identities, agree on identifiers, agree on authorization mechanism, agree on unique ideas, on semantics, how the data is presented, then they can be shared between the different parties. And also there we see that together with different parties also available here, we are working in European platforms, which is of course essential if you want to trust the information that is presented in an electronic format. So all this has, and this is very important, especially in the Benelux context, we see that all this has a very positive impact for the economic operators. And I borrowed here a survey from the Belgian Federation of Companies, whereby we made an assessment of the implementation of the e-CMR in the context of the Benelux project, and whereby they identified that the different parties in the supply chain have an opportunity to save up to 13 euro on the average when they switch from paper documents to electronic documents. Remember, the fact that data is shared at the source in a cloud environment has the advantage that the companies can invoice immediately, but also that every party in the supply chain has the best information which is available. So I think
this was it.
This
All
was
right.
it, yeah.
Thank you, Rudy, for the very interesting talk we had and presentation you gave. I have a question out of the audience, which I would like to ask you, is what are the biggest hurdles for the introduction of a global e-CMR today?
These are very simple. They are two big hurdles. If we listen to the economic operators, to the transport service companies, there are two of them. The first of them is that they say they want to have the same rules, the same regulation all over Europe, even all over the world. And so having a common regulation, that's a number one priority, which is partly going to be saved by the eFTI regulation, which becomes applicable as from 2025. The second thing is that they want to also have a harmonized environment to share data. They want to have standards when a truck is going from one place to the other place and from the other place to the next place. They want to have a standard way to hand over the goods, not that every truck and every customer has a different application. They want to have that standardized. And of course, we see that I'm also working together with Thierry from Paris in some exercises where we want to do that. But these are the biggest hurdles. Otherwise, they will stay with paper.
All right. Some challenges still ahead of us, but it looks very promising if you ask me. Thank you very much, Rudy, for your attendance.
Thank you for the invitation.
Then